Welcome back to HQ Spotlight. Haley Sutton checking in with you, and we're going to the college football ranks. The Arch Manning era officially underway in the Lone Star State, and there's some lofty expectations for the Longhorns this season because for the first time in the program's history, Texas comes in on top of the preseason coaches poll. They edged out the reigning national champs up in Columbus, Ohio, along with a handful of other teams. Now, the Horns are also anchoring our CBS Sports college football preseason poll. You see them there up at the top with Penn State, Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia rounding out the top five. Of course, if you remember, Texas is coming off a season where they advanced all the way to the college football playoff semifinals, and this year, Horns fans are hoping Arch Manning can take them all the way back to the top. Of course, there's always some pushback when it comes to the rankings, so let's do the same song and dance we do with our good friends Chip Patterson and Danny Cannell. Chip, I know you were involved in some of those rankings too. Danny was not, so we're reacting here. We'll get a lot of good conversation going with college football right around the corner. I want to start with the top five rankings, though, gentlemen, because there's been some conversations about who the consensus #1 team is going into the season. We have the top five here. We showed it already earlier. Danny, I'll come to you first here. What do you make of the top five here? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Where are we at?
You know, Haley, our producer, James, he asked, is it accurate? And I said, heck no, it's not accurate. Like, this is the worst top five I've ever seen. But the reason I say that is because it's impossible. It's an impossible task to try to place these top five teams in the, quote, right order. There really isn't a clear-cut favorite, which I think is awesome. Like, I think this is setting up to be one of the more entertaining, wide-open college football teams that we've seen. If it was me, I probably would have gone a little bit towards returning experience at quarterback specifically, knowing the importance of the position that's out there, like a Drew Aller coming back at Penn State or a Cade Klubnik coming back at Clemson. But I get why we have some of those other teams in that top five. But I think overall, it is an impossible task to pin somebody down and say, yep, that, just nailed it as far as 1 through 5, because you can make a strong case for any one of these teams in the top five that they should be #1, or you could say Texas doesn't belong. They should be at #5. Like, they're all interchangeable pieces in my mind.
You could have 1 blank, #2 blank, #3 blank, and then just have a tie. Fourth place right there. The thing that's interesting to me is the Texas Longhorns getting the #1 spot. They got the #1 spot in the coaches poll. They got the #1 spot in the CBS Sports 136. We haven't seen the Longhorns treated like this since 2009, since sort of the immediate wake of when they won that national championship with Vince Young back in 2005. And so it truly does signal to me that the time of waiting for Texas to be back is gone. And now we get to see how Texas deals with real expectations, because they are going to put it on the line with Arch Manning on the road in Columbus, and they do have to go to Georgia. It is going to be interesting because Texas, they've been building, but we have not seen them as the top dog in more than 15 years. Let's see how they handle expectations.
It's so interesting looking at this schedule, guys, because obviously that game we had highlighted, the Red River rivalry, that game used to be like the pinnacle of what Texas would play every year. Now you've got them kicking off the season against Ohio State. You've got Texas A&M in the mix, so there's a lot of matchups and expectations for that Longhorn team. I will mention before we move on here, Chip, you mentioned Vince Young. Mac Brown recently said that he sees a little bit of Arch Manning in Vince Young, kind of sees some parallels in terms of how they've handled that pressure. Maybe not so much playing style, but it will be interesting, to your point, to see if Texas is truly back in that Week 1 matchup against Ohio State. Let's move on to the next 5 teams, where we see Notre Dame, Oregon, Alabama, LSU, and Miami in that 6 through 10 range. Chip, kind of feels like to me this is like the prove it range, right? Like the teams outside of the top 5, they all have championship caliber histories. But in your mind, which of these 5 teams maybe has the most to prove here when it comes to these rankings?
Love the way you asked that question, Haley. It's the Miami Hurricanes. I think Miami at 10 is more of the top of the next tier than the bottom of a 6 through 10. That you get through 9, you feel really good about all those squads, and then you just start grabbing. And what do you grab? You grab one of the most talented rosters in the country, a group that's built up along the offensive and defensive line. You've got future NFL draft picks in Francis Mauigoa and Ruben Bain in terms of what you've got in the trenches. And you've got a big wild card with Carson Beck. Is Carson Carson Beck fully healthy? Can Carson Beck get anything close to the level of production that Cam Ward got? I personally, my bet is no. My bet is that this Miami Hurricanes team has to be a different kind of Miami Hurricanes team in order to be successful. So the Miami team is the ultimate prove-it team in that prove-it range.
Danny, to take it a step further, of those 5, which of these teams do you maybe feel like could be a sleeper, maybe moving up or kind of surprise some people this year?
So, Haley, it's interesting because we're still in the top 10. Sure. People aren't sleeping, but I feel like they're kind of just flying under the radar a little bit. When we were at Big Ten Media Days, it felt like the conversation was revolving around the national champions coming through, Ohio State. Can they repeat? And they're getting a lot of pieces back. And it was Penn State. They're the team that brings everybody back. So they're kind of the favorite. And yet Dan Lanning's squad, who I'll remind people did win the Big Ten last year, going clean through that slate, that people are kind of just they're keeping an eye on them, but it's oh, that's cute. We'll see if they're there at the end of the season. And yet they've got a roster that's been pretty much restocked. They've got an incredible defense because Dan Lanning is a defensive mind. We talked about Mateo Uyunglele on the Cover 3 podcast today earlier on CBS Sports Network. It does come back to the questions at quarterback, but Dante Moore was one of the highest touted recruits when he came out of high school, went to UCLA. He's kind of had this year to catch his breath. If he develops in the potential of what people think he could be, I think Oregon is going to be right back in that conversation, could be right back in the playoff mix. So I think they're sleeping. They're just kind of flying right under the radar of those top 5 teams. I don't think they're getting enough attention.
It almost feels like last year was a jump scare where we talked all season long about them going to win the national championship no matter what, and then they get blown out in their first opportunity to play. So maybe some optimism or cautious optimism when it comes to the Oregon Ducks. Let's move on to our next tier, guys. That is teams in 11 through 20. It's where we find the Sun Devils, last year's Big 12 winners, as well as a handful of SEC and Big Ten teams hoping to make some noise, kind of, DK, to your point. And Danny, the thing that jumps out to me when I'm looking at this graphic is the fact that Tennessee comes in at number 20. Now, this is a team, kind of a similar conversation, where the Nico Iamaleava hype was loud last year. There were high expectations for the Vols. So I'm curious, how much do you think Nico leaving Tennessee impacted their rankings, and what stands out to you about 11 through 20?
So for Tennessee, I do think this massively impacted their perception of the program. And even though he didn't play spectacularly, he had those moments. He started the season so strong, and he had that performance against NC State on the national stage. And the expectation was, all right, he's got 1 year under his belt. He's going to take a big step forward in year 2. And then, of course, we know what unfolded at the spring game. And the fact that it was so late in the game had them scrambling to find a quarterback. And they actually ended up with this pseudo trade with Joey Aguilar coming in from UCLA to Tennessee. Meanwhile, Nico goes out there. It just was so late in the game. I think it's kind of hard to predict what they're going to be. The good news is, if you're Tennessee, is you don't have to be spectacular on offense. They proved that last year. They did have an incredible run game. So I think people are looking at Tennessee and they're like, yeah, I just don't see it. And yet Josh Heupel's proven to be a pretty consistent winner there in Knoxville. So I think it's a school to keep an eye on. The one that drives me nuts, and I just want to get this off my chest, because we have way too many Gators around the office, and I'm wondering if they're in their campaign, like Jacqueline, Zach. We've got people, that work at our desks that help us with the shows. Somebody's in there stuffing the ballots for the Gators, because as much as hype has been around this team, I understand some of it. A lot of returning talent. They finished strong down the stretch. But they must have had these polls taken when the 2 days this offseason when DJ Lagway was healthy, because other than that, he's been banged up and on the injured list most of the offseason. There's way too much unknown about his health for me to say, yep, put him in there at number 12. So we got to find out. I think it's Jacqueline. I think I'm going to put it on her. I think she's out there campaigning.
I'm going to have to tell her you said that. I feel obligated to defend the Gators when Jacqueline is not here. But I kind of feel it, Danny. There is a lot of Gator hype happening in our building. I don't know, though, Chip, because you made these lists. So I don't know. What do you think about what Danny's saying about your rankings?
Well, no, I am one of many voters. I am the curator of this. I am lower than the average of 12. Right. I do have them inside the top 20. They're at 17 in the coaches poll. I think being inside the top 20 is fair. This is the most talented Florida roster that they've had in 5 years. They haven't had Slaughter and Barber on the offensive line, Sapp on the defensive line. Even before you look at the quarterback situation, which is absolutely a concern, we just haven't had a Florida team that has been this loaded up. And I think it speaks to how Billy Billy Napier really does a good job of keeping the locker room together, that more players did not leave this program, because Billy Napier is on the hot seat. And you know that other teams wanted those future NFL draft picks to leave, and they were willing to offer money, but they all wanted to stay. So I think it's okay to be excited about Florida. I just think this is a team that at the end of the season won't have a win-loss record that lines up with a number like 12 in the country just because of the schedule they face. But if you're just going on like a power rating, talent ranking perspective, this is the best Gators team that we have seen in at least 5 or 6 years.
All right, so the Gator, we're still out on the Gators. We'll have to check and see. I will mention that Danny did say that SMU's ranking is also disrespectful. So it's not just Gator hate. He's advocating for other teams as well. But sit tight, guys. We're going to do this all over again in just a few minutes. We're going to need your help for the next segment. In the meantime, take a look at those final 5 teams in our 136 preseason rankings through college football. There they are: Kennesaw State, Ball State, Akron, UMass, and Kent State coming in at 136.